Thank you, Prescott. Thank you, Sparks. Find my control here. Here it is. And we're ready to start with the first slide. Do I click for it? Yes, I will move it forward. Brain and behavior development, socialization, and superdogs. My PhD dissertation, which was published by the University of Chicago Press, was entitled, ambitiously, Integrative Development of Brain and Behavior in the Dog. Really, when I look at it in retrospect, it was several dissertations on different subjects. So it was indeed truly integrative in a sense, tying in ethology, developmental psychobiology, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and so forth. So I'll just give you a taste for that. But because my first degree was from the Royal Veterinary College, London, I am once a veterinarian, always a veterinarian. I was always looking for clinical and practical application of the basic research that I was doing. I believe that knowledge for knowledge's sake has inherent value, but I believe in many ways we're running out of time now, that simply pursuing knowledge for knowledge's sake is a luxury that we really can ill afford because of the plight of the animals, wild and domestic, the plight of the environment, and the predicament of the human species becoming, as I said in discussion yesterday, increasingly a global infestation. This was a mother dog that I photographed in Kashmir during my time on that continent, talking about development. What chance indeed do these puppies have? Think of epigenetics, the nutrition of this mother, her parasite load. We found when my wife opened an animal refuge in South India, in Tamil Nadu, that these village dog mothers are exemplary, extraordinary mothers. They will sometimes nurse the pups until they're 5 months of age, not the normal 6 to 8 weeks weaning, but 4 or 5 months, those puppies are still nursing. So how do puppies respond to images and adult dogs? How do they orient socially when they're socialized? Approach and nose contact with the model pups in adult dogs, facial approach, inguinal approach, anal approach. Anal glands, the groin, there are actual groin glands. There are scent glands on the cheeks. So they're orienting socially to this model. This is one of the ways in which early ethologists, Nico Tinbergen and others, evaluated what is important in the cognitive processing of animals when they approach another one. Where do they go to investigate first? The age in weeks when they approach, the frequency of approach, scoring various parts, especially in the groin area. This is just one example from the study. There's a peak between 8 to 10 weeks of age, and then it drops off. They're less and less interested. More socially curious at that age, between 8 to 10 weeks. We're not sure what learning psychological processes are going on. We'll explore that 8 to 10 week period later. This ties in with John Paul Scott and John Fuller's work on socialization, where puppies show an increasing attraction towards people up to 5 weeks of age, and then it slowly begins to wane, and you see the beginnings of increasing fear towards strangers. When they're left alone without human contact, for 9, 10, 12 weeks of age, they're more and more difficult to approach because the fear period has taken over. So Scott and Fuller argued that there's a critical period to optimally socialize puppies, probably somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks of age. To super socialize them, you start interacting with them a little bit earlier, perhaps. And these were the questions that I was asking in my early handling and socialization studies with puppies. We think of the emotional processes that are slowly developing in these creatures that are born in a relatively immature state. But how mature is the brain? What is the little puppy brain taking in at the time of birth? They possess, like us, the adult dog at least, a core called the limbic system, which processes the emotions and links up with the pituitary gland that regulates various hormonal functions. So already within the anatomy of the brain is telling us that indeed the emotions, which are connected through the senses of sight, scent, vision, and so forth, with the endocrine system, that we have immediate pathways where the endocrine system can be tuned according to the input coming into the brain and being processed through the senses and through the limbic system that mediates the emotional subjective states. And then, of course, we have to keep something generated and going, and that's the reticular activating system with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. In my book, The Domestication of the Dog, I discuss and first published the work of Belyaev and Trut from Russia, with their foxes being selected for docility generation after generation. Changes in the reticular activating system in the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system, which is like a yin-yang. So I thought, well, maybe if I can manipulate the parasympathetic nervous system in some way in puppies, we might produce changes. So more of that shortly. This is one of the dogs from Scott and Fuller's laboratory, a beagle, who had been raised in social isolation, and just turn him over on one side and he goes into a catatonic state, just paralytic fear. It's an extreme example of how the environment can affect behavior. Daniel Friedman, working there, did a PhD under Scott and Fuller, and his work I highly commend, of different ways of handling different breeds can come out very differently. If you overindulge some breeds, they actually grow up to be a little bit more fearful than other breeds. And overindulging was simply lying there and letting the puppy crawl all over you. And by the way, on puppy handling, I do wish, especially with the dog trainers too, to get down on the floor with the animals. And as Mark was saying earlier, play with them too. Let the puppies roll all over you. Now, it was Pfaffenberger, who worked with Scott and Fuller, with the seeing eye dogs out of San Rafael, California. And these are some of the tests that they were doing to see how puppies respond in their selection process. And these puppies must have, as I said yesterday in discussion, some degree of neophobia, fear of novel objects. If they just ignore novel objects, they're not going to be so aware. We don't want to have xenophobia, fear of strangers, however. So they must be well socialized, but alert to novel things to serve effectively as seeing eye dogs or guide animals. But in spite of genetic selection from certain kennels and lineages, German Shepherds, black Labradors, yellow Labradors, and golden retrievers, and so on, Pfaffenberger concluded that the critical thing to produce the best seeing eye dogs for their trainability, for their learning ability, was socialization. So he established a whole network of foster homes for the young puppies, where the puppies would go and get lots of tender, loving care and so on, and then begin the training later. It was not genetic selection so much as socialization that really influenced their performance and utility later. So looking at the brains of puppies from many different points of view, one point of view is looking at myelinization. Myelinization is the development of lipid material around the nerve tracts that connect up part of the brain. And one part that is really important for cognitive processing, and especially in the Pavlovian sense of setting up internal inhibition, are the frontal lobes. You cut the frontal lobes and there's less inhibition, as some of these neuropsychiatrists butchering people earlier on in the past century discovered. The frontal lobes are very important for developing self-control, shall we say, and cognitive processing. So this is the myelin stain in the brain of the frontal lobe of an adult dog. And you see at 10 weeks, it stains quite darkly. 5 weeks, I was surprised to find quite a bit there already, but hardly anything at 4 weeks. So there's, again, a critical stage in the brain hooking up between 4 to 5 weeks, and then this significant developmental step between 5 to 10 weeks, which means that puppies are really going to start learning things after around 5 weeks of age, starting to make associations, regulate the behavior. They're not running out all the time and exploring everything, but they're beginning to start taking things a little more coolly. I will refer to this sequence of experiments shortly, but you can change brainwave activity through early handling. One sign of brainwave activity as the puppy is developing is increased frequency of spindle bursts and wave amplitude and so on. And you will notice here that essentially this EEG is more complex, more enriched, if you wish, than in the control puppy. This puppy and the group that we studied were handled during the first few weeks of life. The handling is described in several of my publications, including picking the puppy up immediately after birth and giving it a half hour of various kinds of stimulation, including putting it in a warm water bath and helping it swim, blowing it dry, turning it upside down, putting it on a little teeter-totter so it gets vestibular cerebellar stimulation, and so forth. And the Russians were doing this work at that time too, and a whole Soviet group, and also a group of American psychobiologists were early handling mice in particular, Gig Levine and Victor Denenberg, and they found that they were able to essentially alter the tuning of the autonomic nervous system, that with early handling, the mice were more exploratory, curious, outgoing, more resistant to stress, and so forth. And I will talk about this again shortly. Fascinating. That's out of place. We'll go forwards now. We'll skip that. So how about their social approaching? We just put a puppy in a long corridor and sit at the other end and see how quickly they approach. Average approach scores, dogs at different ages. The slowest to approach were the 5 to 6 week old groups, but they got faster with each trial at weekly intervals as their motor abilities developed and so forth. But who were the slowest to approach at this time? Regardless, it was that group that began in this experiment at 8 to 9 weeks of age. The group that first started in the corridor test of approaching at 12 to 13 weeks of age, first to put in that situation, really ran to us very quickly after the first trial. Look at that second week. They were just racing towards us. We identified this as a fear period around about 8 to 9 weeks of age. So John Paul Scott and John Fuller had the critical period for socialization, and kind of oscillating within that is a fear or sensitive period of being in novel, strange places. And I think this is critically important because, especially around this age, puppies at 8 to 9 weeks of age will often have their ears cropped, or they'll finish up being shipped out from a puppy mill to pet stores and so forth. Quite an issue of concern. Then we gave puppies, another group of puppies, very mild electrical shock every time they approached us. And again, teasing out the results. The puppies who were during this fear period of 8 to 9 weeks of age tended to develop an aversion of approaching a person and were much slower in approaching compared to the younger group that didn't bother and the older group who were essentially already socially bonded. So very mild inhibitory stimulation did not affect them. Another extraordinary thing, we had some rather primitive biotelemetry available. We found that we could use biotelemetry to see how it affected the heart rate of dogs during physical contact. And this is the typical kind of response that we would get with an adult animal, resting and sitting and looking at us. There's a heart rate, boom, 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 going along merrily. We approach, the animal is more aroused now. That's the arousal response, the heart rate increases. Now remember, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's making the heart rate go up a little bit more. It's the parasympathetic that puts the brakes on. So we make physical contact, start stroking the animal, sometimes just talking to the animal, and then the heart rate goes down. Something jumped there. Well, I'm trying to go back, 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 back. There we go. The heart rate will go down with the physical contact. As I mentioned yesterday, when the human is making contact, that person's blood pressure will go down and various feel-good, beneficial neurochemical neurotransmitters like oxytocin are produced also. So another way of looking at animals is to record their vocalizations. These are expressions of emotional states, intentions at various frequencies, and I must add a note for the play behavior, that dogs indeed do laugh. Part of the expression is to give the play bow and then the panting. And there was a study published recently of broadcasting the sounds of dogs making happy panting noises in an animal shelter, and the dogs were much calmer once they started hearing those sounds. This is a whole other issue. How about the sounds that developing puppies are hearing? Will that affect their physiology? A lot of research to go in here. So looking at the heart rates, and tone of voice or touching can affect the heart rate, which is a reflection of sympathetic or parasympathetic tone. Now, these puppies that we put through the daily routine of handling developed consistently not only the more active brain activity that you've just seen, but higher resting heart rates. And these were statistically significant. After the second week of age, the heart rates began to climb and stayed relatively high compared to controls who went through what I consider the normal increase in heart rate and then going to a lower frequency rate per 10 seconds. I was surprised at this result because the increased resting heart rate is generally regarded as a sign of stress, the kind of executive heart syndrome. But subsequent research that I did in Alaska, in captive wolves in Point Barrow, a military base, where they were doing some horrendous experiments, looking at freezing their feet and comparing their recovery rates with Arctic foxes and finding that you can't freeze the feet of young wolf pups without causing cellular damage, but you can freeze the feet of adult wolves and not cause cellular damage, which I found totally bizarre, but they were designing combat boots for the military based on this research, for which I found no connection. But they had all these wolf cubs. So we decided to look non-invasively as possible at their individual differences. And we discovered that in those wolf cubs that were the most outgoing, who were essentially the potential leaders in their family packs, they had also the highest resting heart rates. The lower resting heart rates were the more fearful, less outgoing wolf cubs. The scientists that I was working with took blood samples and looked at plasma cortisol levels and how they responded to adrenocorticotrophic stimulating hormone, injecting them with a small amount. And we found that our cubs with the highest resting heart rates showed a significant response to the adrenocorticotrophic stimulating hormone. Their adrenal systems were more flexible, if you wish, while the more fearful ones with the lower resting heart rates had virtually no response. Their cortisol levels were already sky high. Kind of a paradoxical effect, but worth looking at. Now back to the work of Victor Denenberg and the other developmental psychobiologists. When you handle a pregnant animal, a pregnant rodent, the offspring will be more exploratory, more outgoing, more stress resistance, all kinds of differences compared to the offspring of non-handled. Now that you could say, well, the mother's going to treat them differently because she's been handled. So what they do with some of them is to cross-foster, that you put the offspring from a handled rodent onto another rodent who was not handled. But you still find differences, that the offspring of the handled mothers tended to perform in a superior way, were more adaptable to stress and so forth. So I applied my handling principles of early handling, environmental enrichment, and very intense socialization to improve the well-being and performance of the Army Superdogs at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They were using these dogs in combat in Vietnam, and after I left the students, after addressing their protests at the university against the war, I would go to Aberdeen Proving Grounds and try to make things better for the dogs. They were having problems with their German Shepherds. They were all being kept in cages. They were not being socialized. The puppies were terrified. They were very unstable, but they were training them anyway and shipping them out. So they instigated my handling procedures. They had one veterinarian from the Army Veterinary Corps who did a master's degree with me on this, and we found indeed that the dogs who had the early enrichment and early handling performed far better under the stress in field and certainly helped save many lives. But the terrible thing is that these dogs were treated by the military as mere military equipment, and because of ehrlichiosis were not allowed to be brought back after the war to the United States. The military does need to improve its treatment of war dogs, and while I'm just harping on that scene, I'm appalled that dogs working for disaster rescue, like the recent Oklahoma tornado, they're not wearing any protective boots or protective body gear. This needs to be changed. A lot of these animals are put out because of penetrating wounds. It's simply wrong. But I want to emphasize with this wonderful picture of a dog fetus that how the mother is handled, how she is treated, and I mentioned yesterday her nutrition. The nutrition and the emotional status of the mother will affect the offspring. This is epigenetics, and it's a whole new field of potential preventive medicine, and it's a whole new field for producing more adjustable dogs. And this is how it works. In the developing and integrating nervous system, you have the autonomic nervous system and the reticular arousing system. That's the visceral level one. And you can start tuning this prenatally. The next is the emotional, the limbic system, that is integrated with that as the puppy or human infant is developing. And that is the social emotional level. of integration. And then the next is the frontal lobes start hooking up into the neocortex, the socio-environmental. So the environmental enrichment is important. The problem with the military dogs and the military puppies that they were just being kept in cages. So part of the regime later was to take them around the base in trucks and have these soldiers and whatever walking them around everywhere, taking them to the grocery store and into the mess and so on. And those puppies were completely different. So how do we look at the basic determinants of animal behavior and the ultimate outcome? We consider in our brains as we're thinking what's best for the animal and what's best for us to get the best out of these animals are the genetic influences, the kind of selective breeding going on, the early developmental influences, and these feed into what you might call the temperament or the behavioral phenotype. Then you have the shouldn't be post, but that's what they did in Japan when I gave this talk, the post-maturational influences. And that's what we're talking about, the post-maturational influences. And the phenodeviance, how much variation are you going to have within the litter? They're not all going to turn out the same anyway. And then the normal actualization and the ethodeviance, abnormal behaviors. Big question, how cognitively aware are animals? I think part of the awareness is related to the frontal lobe connections. And certainly, we need to avoid simplistic tests. I must wrap up quickly now. It's reaching the critical hour. Gordon Gallup, one psychologist often quoted for his work on self-awareness in animals, found that chimpanzees and more recent studies, elephants and dolphins will recognize that their mirror image has been changed if there's been a mark put on their heads or their bodies. People say, well, dogs don't respond to the mirrors. They will bark, perhaps, but they recognize, do they think it's another dog? Probably initially, but eventually they ignore themselves in the mirror generally. I've put marks on dogs to see if they'll do anything, but that's stupid. My conclusion here is that the dogs are not stupid. The dogs are less narcissistic. They know it's not another dog, and they know it's themselves, so they ignore it. If they were more narcissistic, they wouldn't. Many dogs, and cats too, will actually go behind the mirror to see what's there. So, they are cognitively processing extremely well. So to move forwards very quickly now on socialization, some of these early studies for self-identity awareness, we raised a Chihuahua with a litter of kittens. We did a bunch of these in Galesburg, Illinois, and we published the data. Absolutely fascinating that the little Chihuahuas basically would not respond to themselves in the mirror, but those who had been raised with their own species, the dogs, would go bonkers seeing themselves in the mirror, while those who had never seen a dog before would not respond to the mirror image for a while, and then eventually they did recover. So socialization can indeed determine identity, and I feel very sorry for these parrots that are hand raised and then try to make love with their owners because they think their owners are parrots or something crazy going on. So the bottom line here is to encourage people who have one dog to get another dog. I won't go into I will briefly, the early neonatal, looking at the reflexes. I studied all the neurologic development, the head sway, the thermoreceptors, positive, negative geotropic effects, and so on. And we found that there is indeed early learning at the olfactory level, olfactory imprinting, and operating at different levels. And the whole smell zone, we go to different places. Here's the burning bush, the realm of olfaction in the dog. But remember, puppies will develop an olfactory imprint within 24 to 48 hours, depending on what the mother's breasts smell like, the mammary region. Many trees die as a consequence in some urban areas, and they all line up. The rolling, I think, for us to get into that realm of the senses, of olfaction, we would probably stop speaking, because what another realm it is. And I do feel that, some people say, well, wolves will roll in scent to mask their own odor before they go hunting. No, they just roll in things just like some people like to wear Chanel perfume. They get a lot of social attention. Oh my goodness, you really do smell right. We'll skip that. Now I want to look at the other realm of communication, which was alluded to very briefly before I wrap up, going beyond science, not into mysticism, but what I call metaphysics. This is Bay, an extraordinary dog. Bay was the first in his family to know of grandfather's death thousands of miles away. I mentioned this yesterday. The remote sensing, evidence for the empathosphere. The dog was very closely connected, suddenly started whining and showing clear distress. Telephone rang sometime later saying that a loved one died. That's Bay, he's mentioned in my book. Bay, the dog who entered the empathosphere to remote sense death. This is Shotster, who in the early 50s amazed his family. He was at home, and they buried one of the family members in a graveyard in Illinois, about 10 miles away. Shotster disappeared later that day, was missing for the week, and they found him lying on the gravesite. How did he get there? Part of the great mystery. A good example of empathy, a German Shepherd in England, or Alsatians as they call them, with his companion blind Cocker Spaniel, will take him by the ear to cross the yard and open doors for him and so on. A dog becoming a guide for another dog. This is awareness, this is a high degree of empathy. I was asked from one show, Dr. Fox, what do you think is the most highly developed ability of dogs? And I said, their power of empathy. Artists have celebrated this. The sheepdog mourning the death of the shepherd. I think that was John Constable. Greyfriars Bobby in Edinburgh. The statue in Tokyo for this dog who waited by the railroad station for his master to come home after he died. And then going into the metaphysics of lights appearing after the death of one companion dog. This lady, whose portrait was taken in the 50s by the husband sometime after their little chihuahua died, and they could not account for the image of a chihuahua against the wall there. I've got scores of letters from people describing how their animals seem to appear after they die. Sometimes sounds on the ground, sometimes being brushed against their body. One couple moved into a house where both of them felt a cat jump on the bed for about a year. And they learned that a cat had died in that house before they bought it. How much of this is brain conditioning, association, a way of dealing with grief? We don't know. But to wrap up, little girl was playing outside the schoolyard and shouted to her parents, "Look, there's Brandy in the sky." And they saw Brandy, their golden retriever, who had died recently. Another image way of looking at it. Many people are convinced that the animals do sometimes come back. Here is a strange little image of one dog on the walk, and you might call it an astral body of another dog. Their companion dog who had died a couple of days before, coming with them on the habitual walk. We don't know. But either way, we have to be open to mystery. We're part of a dream. We are part of the dream that is dreaming us, to quote an Akung Bushman. To quote Bill Nyaigi, in his response to somebody cutting down a tree, he's an Australian Aboriginal, we feel these things. We feel the burning of the tree, the cutting of the tree, the burning of the grass, because we are part of the tree, we're part of the grass. And I think as scientists studying animal behavior, as dog trainers, people enjoying the companionship of animals, this power of empathy will open our minds to even greater realities about which still we're totally naive. And Konrad Lorenz did shock some ethologists, hard-nosed scientists, at the international conference in Rennes many years ago, when he addressed the crowd saying, before you study an animal, you must first love it. Thank you.